Arizona Territory, 1878. The sun baked the red earth of Cottonwood Creek into a hard crust, and every living thing sought what little shade could be found. Xavier Jameson rode slowly across the shimmering landscape, his hand occasionally rising to shield his blue eyes from the glare. At 24, he had already spent half his life in the saddle, working cattle across 3 territories, and had the lean, sun-hardened look of a man who lived beneath open skies. Xavier adjusted his Stetson and patted his dun gelding's neck. "Just you and me, Thunder. That's how it ought to stay." The words tasted like dust in his mouth, but Xavier believed them with every fiber of his being. A man couldn't count on much in these parts, but he could count on this. Love was a luxury the frontier didn't afford. His parents' homestead had been raided when he was 12, leaving him orphaned and convinced that attachment only led to heartbreak. The West demanded solitude as the price of survival. Xavier had just purchased a small tract of land near the Silver Creek foothills, intending to raise cattle far from the complications of town life. No neighbors, no entanglements, no vulnerabilities, just honest work under the endless Arizona sky. The local ranchers had warned him about Apache activity in the area, but Xavier kept to himself, figuring that a lone cowboy posed no threat to anyone. As evening approached, Xavier made camp by a shallow creek. He unsaddled Thunder and staked him on a long lead near a patch of desert grass. The night passed quietly beneath a canopy of stars, with only the occasional coyote howl breaking the silence. But when Xavier woke at dawn and reached for his canteen, a cold realization struck him. Thunder was gone. The rope had been cleanly cut, not broken. Xavier cursed, scanning the horizon. His rifle, provisions, and modest savings were secure, but without a horse, he was effectively stranded 15 miles from the nearest settlement. Worse still, that horse represented half his worldly wealth and his only means of working his new land. "Damn it all," Xavier muttered, gathering what he could carry. He'd have to walk to town, report the theft, and hope the sheriff might help, though frontier justice rarely extended to recovering stolen livestock. His second day of trekking had barely begun when Xavier spotted a dust cloud approaching from the east. He gripped his rifle, squinting at the horizon. As the figure drew closer, his breath caught. It was Thunder, moving at a steady trot, but the horse wasn't alone. Perched on his back was a woman. Even at a distance, Xavier could tell she was Apache by her dress and the distinctive way she rode. As they approached, Xavier raised his rifle cautiously, uncertain whether this was a threat or something else entirely. When Thunder halted 20 paces away, Xavier finally saw her clearly. She was younger than he'd expected, perhaps 22, with coal-black hair plaited into a single braid that hung past her waist. Her skin was the color of burnished copper in the morning light, and her dark eyes regarded him with a mixture of wariness and determination. She wore a simple buckskin dress adorned with intricate beadwork, and a knife was visibly sheathed at her waist. She dismounted gracefully, keeping one hand on Thunder's reins. "Your horse," she said in clear, accented English, "was drinking from sacred water." Xavier lowered his rifle slightly. "You speak English." "I am Dejanira Whiteriver," she replied. "My father was a translator for the army before he died." The name struck Xavier as unusual, a blend of her heritage and the white world she'd evidently had some contact with. She was beautiful in a way that made his chest tighten unexpectedly, her features delicate yet strong. "Xavier Jameson," he replied, still wary. "Why bring my horse back? Most would keep him." Dejanira's expression hardened. "I am not a thief. The water where your horse drank belongs to my people. Taking him was—" She paused, searching for the word, "a lesson." "A lesson I've learned," Xavier said, taking a step forward. "Thank you for returning him." She nodded, but didn't immediately release the reins. "You have settled on contested land, Cowboy. The ranch you build sits between worlds." Xavier felt a chill despite the morning heat. "The deed's legal. I bought it fair." "The white man's papers mean nothing to the land itself," she replied, but there was no anger in her voice, only a tired certainty. "There is danger there. For both our peoples." With that cryptic warning, she handed over Thunder's reins and turned to leave. "Wait," Xavier called, surprising himself. "It's a long walk back to your people. At least let me offer you water for your journey." Something flickered in Dejanira's eyes, surprise, perhaps, or curiosity. She hesitated, then nodded once. As they shared water from his canteen, Xavier found himself studying her face, noticing how her eyes caught the sunlight. "Why are you alone out here?" he asked. "It's dangerous." "I could ask you the same question," she replied, the ghost of a smile touching her lips. "Perhaps we are both fools." Their brief encounter lasted less than an hour before Dejanira departed, walking with purpose toward the eastern foothills. Xavier watched her go, an unfamiliar feeling settling in his chest. He told himself it was merely relief at recovering Thunder, but as he continued toward his homestead, her words about contested land echoed in his thoughts. 3 days later, Xavier was repairing a section of broken fence when he noticed smoke rising from the ridge above his small cabin. He grabbed his rifle and approached cautiously, expecting trouble, but instead found Dejanira sitting calmly beside a small fire. Beside her lay a deer, freshly killed and partially dressed. "You should watch your northern boundary," she said without preamble. 3 men have been tracking cattle there. "Not Apache," she added, seeing his expression. "White rustlers." Xavier lowered his rifle. "Why are you helping me?" Dejanira stood, wiping her hands on a cloth. "The land you've settled holds significance for my people. If rustlers establish themselves here, the army will blame us." "So this is self-preservation," Xavier said, unable to keep the disappointment from his voice. "Perhaps," she replied, looking directly at him. "Or perhaps I do not wish to see a man die simply because he does not understand what land he has claimed." She gestured to the deer. "Half is yours. Payment for trespassing on your property." Xavier shook his head. "You don't need to." "I do," she interrupted. "My people honor debts and boundaries, despite what your kind believe." They divided the meat in silence, and as the sun began to set, Xavier found himself asking, "Will you eat with me?" "I have coffee." Dejanira's expression revealed nothing, but after a moment, she nodded. As they sat before the fire outside his cabin, Xavier learned that she was the daughter of a respected medicine woman and a white translator who had died of fever 5 years earlier. She walked between 2 worlds, never fully accepted by either. Her band camped in the foothills during summer months, following traditional patterns despite increasing pressure from the reservation system. "You're taking a risk," Xavier said quietly, "coming to a white man's property alone." "Life is risk," she replied simply, "especially now, when the old ways are dying." As darkness fell, Xavier insisted on escorting her partway back to her people's camp. Under the vast canopy of stars, he found himself talking more than he had in years, telling her about losing his family, his years driving cattle, his dream of a quiet life. "You believe being alone keeps you safe," she observed as they reached the boundary of his property. "Doesn't it?" Xavier asked. Dejanira shook her head. "It only ensures you die without witnesses." With those words, she disappeared into the darkness, leaving Xavier staring after her, troubled by how her simple wisdom had pierced the armor he'd worn for so long. Over the next 3 weeks, their paths crossed with increasing frequency. Xavier would find fresh tracks near his water pump or glimpse movement along the ridge. Sometimes Dejanira would appear openly, bringing herbs for his persistent cough or pointing out where boundary markers had been moved, evidence that someone was encroaching on his claim. Other times, she would accept his invitations to share a meal, teaching him which local plants were edible and which were poisonous. Despite himself, Xavier began looking forward to these encounters. He found himself shaving more regularly, keeping his cabin tidier. When trading in town, he purchased coffee of better quality than he would normally allow himself. One evening as they watched the sunset from his porch, Dejanira explained the significance of the land he had settled. "This valley was once neutral ground where different bands could meet in peace," she said. "My grandfather was born here, beneath that twisted oak." She pointed to an ancient tree that stood sentinel over his south pasture. "I didn't know," Xavier said quietly. "How could you?" She replied without accusation. "Your people see land as something to be owned, not something to be understood." As twilight deepened into night, Xavier found himself telling her things he had never spoken aloud, about the nightmares that still plagued him, about his fear that he was destined to lose anything he cared for. "My father used to say that fear is a poor compass," Dejanira said softly. "It only shows you where not to go, never where you should." When their hands accidentally touched as she passed him a cup of coffee, Neither pulled away for several heartbeats. Xavier felt something crack within his chest, like ice breaking on a spring river. Their peaceful routine shattered 3 days later. Xavier returned from town to find his cabin door splintered open, his few possessions scattered. More alarmingly, someone had left a crude warning slashed into his table: "Leave or die." As he assessed the damage, hoofbeats approached. Xavier raised his rifle, only to lower it when he recognized Dejanira riding Thunder. Apparently, she had found him wandering again. "You need to leave," she said urgently, dismounting. "The men I warned you about, they're not just rustlers. They work for Clayton Forrester." The name sent a chill through Xavier. Forrester was notorious throughout the territory, a wealthy rancher who expanded his holdings through intimidation and violence when legal methods failed. "I won't be run off my land," Xavier said stubbornly. "This isn't about bravery," Dejanira insisted, her eyes flashing. "Forrester wants this valley as a corridor for moving his herds. He will kill you without hesitation." "Then I'll speak to the sheriff," Xavier replied, though he knew how futile that would likely be. "The sheriff?" Dejanira's laugh was bitter. "The same sheriff who turns away when Forrester's men harass our hunting parties? The same one who ignored the murder of my cousin last winter?" Xavier had no answer. The unfairness of it all, that a man like Forrester could simply take what he wanted through force, burned in his throat. Dejanira stepped closer, placing her hand on his arm. "Come with me to my people's camp, just until it's safe." "Your people would never accept me," Xavier said. "Some would not," she acknowledged. "But my grandmother is an elder. Her word carries weight." Xavier looked at his ransacked cabin, the crude threat carved into his table. Everything in him rebelled against running. And yet, for the first time in years, he had something to live for beyond mere survival. "I need to secure my stock first," he said. Together, they worked through dusk to move his small herd of cattle to a hidden box canyon Dejanira knew of. As night fell, they made their way to the Apache camp, approaching cautiously. Xavier felt the weight of suspicious stares as Dejanira led him to a fire where an elderly woman sat, her face deeply lined but her eyes sharp and alert. The conversation that followed was conducted mostly in Apache, with Dejanira occasionally translating. Xavier understood little, but the tension in the air was unmistakable. Finally, the old woman, Dejanira's grandmother, nodded once. "You may stay 3 days," Dejanira translated. "After that, the council will decide." Those 3 days changed everything for Xavier. Initially, he was met with cold stares and muttered comments. But as he worked alongside the men, helping to repair shelters and tend to horses, showing respect for their customs, the hostility gradually lessened. He watched Dejanira among her people, confident, respected, laughing with children who clearly adored her. She was different here, more herself, and Xavier realized he was seeing her truly for the first time. Each night, they would talk beside the fire, their conversations deepening, the space between them gradually shrinking. On the third evening, as they walked to the edge of the camp beneath a blanket of stars, Dejanira spoke of her father. "He loved my mother enough to leave his world behind," she said softly. "But he never truly belonged in hers. And when he died, I inherited his position, never fully Apache, never white." "Is that why you sought me out?" Xavier asked. "Because you recognized something similar?" She turned to face him. "I sought you out because your horse drank from sacred water," she said with a small smile. "I stayed because I saw a man fighting the same war as me, the battle against loneliness." When her hand rose to touch his face, Xavier didn't pull away. And when their lips met beneath the vast Arizona sky, something long frozen within him began to thaw. The council's decision the next day was mixed. Xavier could visit their camp, but could not stay permanently. It was more acceptance than he had dared hope for, but it solved nothing about the threat to his land. "I need to return," he told Dejanira. "I won't let Forrester steal what's mine." "Then I will come with you," she said without hesitation. Xavier shook his head. "It's too dangerous. These men have threatened my people's lands for years," she interrupted. "This fight was mine before it was yours." They returned to find Xavier's fence cut in multiple places and 3 of his cattle missing. More ominously, a crude scaffold had been erected near his cabin with a noose hanging from it, a message that couldn't be clearer. That night, as they kept watch from the ridge above the cabin, Xavier finally voiced what had been growing in his heart. When this is over, whatever happens, I don't want to be alone anymore. Dejanira's hand found his in the darkness. Then don't be. Their vigil was rewarded near dawn when they spotted 3 riders approaching the cabin. Xavier recognized 2 as hired guns he'd seen in town, men known for doing Forrester's dirty work. The third, a heavy-set man with a bushy beard, was unfamiliar. That's Forrester's foreman, Dejanira whispered. Samuel Hicks. He does what his boss is too careful to do himself. They watched as the men entered the empty cabin, then emerged cursing when they found no one inside. Hicks began issuing orders to search the property. We need to leave, Xavier whispered. Get help. From whom? Dejanira asked. The sheriff won't intervene, and my people cannot openly fight white men without bringing the army down on them. She was right, Xavier knew. They were alone in this fight. Then we need to make it too costly for them, he said grimly. Using tactics Dejanira had learned from childhood and Xavier's knowledge of ranch operations, they began a campaign of strategic resistance. They removed Forrester's boundary markers, scattered his men's horses, and left warnings of their own, arrows embedded in cabin doors and cattle driven back from where they'd been placed on Xavier's land. For 2 weeks, they waged their quiet war, sleeping in caves and moving constantly. Though they never directly confronted Forrester's men, the message was clear: this land would not be taken easily. The situation reached its breaking point when they returned from scouting to find a column of smoke rising from the direction of Xavier's cabin. They arrived to find the structure engulfed in flames, clearly deliberately set. Enough, Xavier said, his voice tight with anger. Tomorrow, I'm going to town to confront Forrester directly. That's suicide, Dejanira protested. He'll have you killed before you reach the main street. Then what would you have me do? Xavier demanded. Watch as everything I've worked for burns. Dejanira was silent for a moment. There is another way, she finally said. But you must trust me completely. The next morning, Forrester's foreman and 4 hired guns rode onto Xavier's property, intending to drive off his remaining cattle. Instead, they found themselves surrounded by 15 Apache warriors who seemed to materialize from the landscape itself. Among them stood Xavier and Dejanira. The warriors made no aggressive moves, but merely held their positions, arrows nocked. What the hell is this? Hicks demanded, his hand hovering near his pistol. This, Xavier said clearly, is a message for Forrester. The deed to this land is legal and filed in Tucson. More importantly, it sits on ground sacred to these people, who have granted me permission to remain here under their protection. You've gone native, Hicks spat. Forrester will have the army sweep this whole area clean when he hears about this. Will he? Dejanira stepped forward. Before you make threats, you should know that my cousin serves as a scout for Captain Thomas at Fort Whipple. The captain is quite interested in reports of white men falsely blaming Apache for cattle rustling to justify military action. This was a calculated bluff. Her cousin had indeed once been a scout, but no longer held that position. Yet the mention of the fort commander's name had its intended effect. Hicks's expression wavered. Additionally, Xavier continued, I've written to the territorial governor detailing Forrester's methods of acquiring land. The letter will be delivered by Dejanira's brother if any harm comes to either of us. This, too, was an exaggeration. The letter existed but had not yet been sent. But the seed of doubt had been planted. You're making a powerful enemy, Hicks warned, but his bluster had diminished. So are you, Xavier replied steadily. Leave my land now. Tell Forrester to find another route for his cattle. For a tense moment, it seemed Hicks might order his men to fight. But faced with determined Apache warriors and the threat of official investigation, he finally spat on the ground and ordered his men to withdraw. When they had disappeared from sight, the tension broke. The Apache men, all relatives or friends of Dejanira who had agreed to help, began to disperse, some clasping Xavier's hand in newfound respect. They will return, Dejanira said when they were alone. Perhaps, Xavier agreed. But not today, and tomorrow, I really will send that letter to the governor. As they stood amid the charred remains of his cabin, Xavier took Dejanira's hands in his. I've lost my home, he said, but I found something more valuable. And what is that? She asked, though her eyes suggested she already knew the answer. A future I never thought possible, he replied. One I don't want to face alone. That evening, as they made plans to rebuild, Dejanira revealed what Xavier had begun to suspect. Her grandmother had recognized his family name. His mother, before marrying his father, had once treated the old woman's son for fever when other white doctors had refused. This connection, tenuous but significant, had been why the Apache Council had granted their protection. Some deaths span generations, Dejanira explained. My grandmother believes our meeting was the ancestors' way of bringing balance. And what do you believe? Xavier asked. Dejanira smiled, touching the place above his heart. I believe that loneliness recognizes itself across any divide. In the months that followed, Xavier and Dejanira rebuilt both his cabin and his life. The letter to the governor, combined with testimonies from other small ranchers Forrester had intimidated, led to an investigation that significantly curtailed the man's influence. While tensions between settlers and Apache remained throughout the territory, Xavier's land became a small island of cooperation. With Dejanira's guidance, Xavier established his ranch in ways that respected the sacred spaces on his property. A portion of the land was set aside where her people could gather seasonally for ceremonies without fear of interference. In return, several young Apache men occasionally worked alongside Xavier, learning ranching skills while teaching him their profound knowledge of the land. Their wedding the following spring was unlike any the territory had seen. Conducted first by a traveling preacher from town, then blessed in an Apache ceremony beneath the ancient oak tree. Some townspeople refused to attend, and certain members of Dejanira's band stayed away, but those who came witnessed something remarkable, two worlds finding common ground. Standing before the gathered witnesses, Xavier looked into Dejanira's eyes and finally understood the truth that had eluded him for so long. The frontier's harshness wasn't a reason to remain isolated, but precisely why connections mattered more. What made survival possible wasn't building walls, but building bridges. I once believed that being alone kept me safe, he said, holding her hands beneath the oak's spreading branches. You showed me that safety without meaning is just another kind of death. Dejanira's smile was radiant as she replied, and you showed me that standing between two worlds doesn't mean belonging to neither. It means being able to build something new. By the following year, their ranch had begun to prosper modestly. The cabin had expanded into a proper home, and signs of their shared life were everywhere. Apache crafts alongside settler furniture, medicinal herbs drying next to preserved frontier foods. More significantly, Dejanira was expecting their first child, a new life that would embody the bridge they had built between their worlds. One evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the Arizona sky in brilliant oranges and purples, thunder grazed contentedly in the near pasture. The same horse whose disappearance had set their unlikely story in motion. Do you ever regret it? Xavier asked. Choosing a life that keeps you caught between worlds. Dejanira took his hand and placed it gently on her growing belly. This child will inherit both worlds, not be trapped between them, she said. That is not a burden, but a gift. As darkness settled over the land that had once seemed so unforgiving to Xavier, he understood at last what Dejanira had tried to tell him from the beginning. The frontier wasn't merely a place of isolation and danger. It was also where new beginnings were possible, where the future was being written by those brave enough to imagine it differently. I lost a horse and found a future, Xavier mused, drawing her close. Dejanira laughed softly, and I returned a horse and found a home. Together they watched as the first stars appeared in the vast Arizona sky, pioneers of a different kind of frontier, one where love had indeed proven stronger than the harsh landscape that had tried to convince them that connection was impossible. Their joined hands rested protectively over the child who would one day inherit their bridge between worlds, living proof that even on the wild frontier, the human heart could find its way home.